The first time I saw them, I froze, my chest tightening as the faint, eerie glow of the trench lights stretched across the water, pulsating like something alive. I remember the first rule whispering in my mind, even before I knew all 11, never stare too long at the lights. Out here, 36,000 feet below the surface, everything feels suffocating and silent. Yet there's a presence that watches your every move, testing patience, daring you to break the rules. I've learned that even the smallest misstep can ripple into something deadly, and every rule carries a weight I can't escape. Tonight, I wonder which of the 11 rules will be the one I break first. The moment I descended into the Mariana Trench, the lights above seemed almost alive, pulsing faintly like distant lanterns in an endless void. I reminded myself quietly, almost like a mantra, that I had to obey Rule 1. Never stare at the trench lights for longer than a minute, or you risk drawing attention from what lurks in the depths. My eyes wanted to linger, tracing the delicate patterns of glowing bioluminescence, but there was an uneasy pressure in the water around me, as if the dark itself was breathing and watching. Every flicker made my heart jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights weren't just guiding me. They were observing, calculating. I tightened my grip on the metal railing of the submersible, feeling the vibrations of machinery hum beneath my fingers. Each step further into the abyss deepened a sense of isolation I hadn't anticipated, as if the trench itself had swallowed all hope of the surface. Shadows warped across the hull, elongating in strange, impossible ways, and I could hear the faint thrum of the pressure system struggling to maintain equilibrium. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Yet when a low current shifted the water, it felt like something unseen was nudging me, testing my resolve. The lights flickered again, this time in irregular bursts, and I felt the urge to look longer than I knew I should. The crew around me seemed oblivious to the unease, joking quietly over the comms about how the trench always played tricks on first-timers. "You're too tense," one of them said, laughter threading through static. "Just focus on the instruments." I tried, glancing at the monitors tracking the depth and pressure, but peripheral movement kept dragging my gaze toward the faint luminescent glow ahead. Even knowing Rule 1, my curiosity gnawed at me. Each pulse of light felt like it was breathing in sync with my own heart, daring me to break the first rule that kept us all alive. As we advanced, the narrow canyon walls of the trench seemed to close in, water moving sluggishly around us, as if the pressure itself were a living entity. I could see forms just beyond the reach of the submersible's lights, indistinct, writhing shapes that disappeared whenever I blinked or tried to focus. One of the younger divers whispered over the comms, "Do you feel it too, like we're not alone?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and felt my stomach twist with dread. Each glance at the lights threatened to pull me in, a dangerous hypnosis that made every shadowed movement more menacing, more urgent. I tried to speak to myself out loud to keep control. "Don't look too long, don't." But the words barely registered before my eyes wandered again to the shifting glow. For a moment, I imagined the lights forming patterns, symbols that seemed deliberately arranged for me alone. My rational mind screamed it was just refraction and algae, but something primal whispered otherwise. The first rule was meant to protect me from curiosity itself, and already I felt that invisible tether stretching tighter with each second I resisted. Every pulse seemed synchronized with a heartbeat far older than mine, echoing through the trench in a rhythm that felt like it could swallow me whole. The submersible drifted near a ledge where strange formations jutted upward, translucent and glimmering faintly. I caught movement there, slow and deliberate, like something circling just beyond our sensors. The diver beside me laughed nervously, probably just sediment or fish. But I could sense awareness in that darkness, a patient intelligence watching, learning, waiting. Rule 1 felt heavier than ever. I understood it wasn't about the lights themselves, but about drawing attention from whatever dwelled beneath them. My fingers tightened on the console, muscles tense, ready for whatever came next. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each heartbeat echoing inside the submersible's hull, Shadows shifted, and my eyes ached from the glow, yet I couldn't stop looking completely. The water pressed in from all sides, cold and suffocating, yet alive with movement I could not explain. A subtle vibration ran along the metal, almost like a pulse responding to the flicker of light above, and for the first time I truly understood the purpose of the first rule. It wasn't a guideline, it was a lifeline, fragile and thin, keeping me tethered to survival in a place that seemed to reject human presence entirely. I remember a moment when a strange form emerged briefly, just beyond the range of the submersible's lights. It was indistinct, undulating, something that belonged to neither fish nor shadow. My breath caught, and I instinctively tore my gaze away from the glowing surface above, forcing my eyes downward to the console. The diver next to me muttered, "It's nothing, probably just the lights playing tricks." But deep down, I knew better. Breaking the first rule, even slightly, had given the abyss the opportunity to notice me, and I felt the pressure of its gaze, heavy and cold. As we descended further, I tried to focus entirely on the mission, checking instruments, logging depth and temperature, anything to distract from the hypnotic lure above. But the rhythm of the trench lights called again and again, a silent beckoning I couldn't fully resist. The tension between fear and curiosity gnawed at me relentlessly, and I realized the rule was as much about restraint as survival. Any deviation, however small, risked something far beyond our understanding. Already, I could feel the subtle difference in the water's movement, the small deliberate currents that suggested we were being observed. The diver beside me finally broke the silence, whispering urgently, "Did you see that? Something's moving in the shadows near the wall." I nodded, unable to respond with words. The lights flickered in response, or at least it felt that way, as if whatever existed in the trench acknowledged our attention. I leaned forward, forcing myself to focus on readings, on tasks, but the tension never left my chest. The first rule, simple and seemingly innocuous, had become a living presence, and I understood why the trainers had drilled it into us before even descending. Obedience wasn't just safety, it was sanity. Time blurred as we continued, every moment heavy with the weight of unspoken rules, the invisible watcher just beyond reach. Shadows coiled and uncoiled along the trench walls, strange shapes darting away the instant I tried to focus. I could feel the lights above pulsing, almost like breathing, and I reminded myself once more that this was exactly what Rule 1 warned against. Every second of hesitation, every glance too long invited consequences that I could not yet imagine. And as we rounded a jagged ridge where the abyss seemed to stretch forever downward, I sensed that something had noticed me, something patient, intelligent, and hungry. The submersible's lights revealed nothing, but the weight in the water changed, subtle but undeniable. I could feel eyes, or the essence of attention, tracing every movement, every twitch of my fingers, every cautious step along the ledge. I wanted to speak, to comfort myself, but the silence of the trench swallowed words instantly. The faint glow above continued its hypnotic rhythm, a heartbeat I dared not match. Already, the first rule had proven its necessity, and yet I knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. One mistake, and the observer waiting in the darkness would no longer be patient. The moment I considered dimming the submersible lights, a shiver ran down my spine, and I reminded myself quietly, almost out loud, of Rule 2. Never turn off the submersible lights, even if you feel the glow above is too distracting, or you risk losing all sense of direction. For a split second, I imagined plunging into absolute darkness, the bioluminescent pulses from above, teasing the edge of my vision, and my mind screamed at me that any lapse could be catastrophic. The trench was alive with subtle currents that twisted unpredictably, and in total darkness, every movement would become a blind guess, every shadow a potential predator. I gripped the console, refusing to even imagine what might be circling just beyond our limited view. As the submersible drifted closer to the abyssal cliff walls, the walls themselves seemed almost sentient, their jagged shapes absorbing light in impossible ways. I could feel the water pressing differently here, swirling in patterns that no human could naturally produce. The glow above remained steady, teasing, almost whispering for me to glance too long or experiment with shutting off our lights. One of the crew, more reckless than I, muttered, "Maybe we could turn them off for a second, just to see." And I snapped at him, heart pounding. "You don't even know what's down here," I said, keeping my voice low, the words vibrating through the metal hull. Every instinct screamed compliance, but the temptation was maddening. I focused on the instruments, scanning depth readings and sonar signals, trying to anchor myself in reality while the lights above pulsed rhythmically. The water outside seemed to grow denser as we descended, like it was intentionally pressing in to test our resolve. Shadows elongated unnaturally, folding back on themselves in ways that made me question physics itself. I whispered to myself again, "Keep the lights on, stay on course," and felt the full weight of Rule 2 settle into my consciousness. The presence in the darkness didn't just notice us. It responded, small ripples along the hull signaling attention, awareness, and curiosity that I could not afford to ignore. Every corridor within the submersible felt tighter, narrower, as if the darkness beyond the lights were reaching toward us, trying to claim space that wasn't ours. I caught the younger diver fumbling near the emergency controls, his fingers twitching dangerously close to the switch. "Don't you dare," I hissed, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. He froze, eyes wide, finally remembering the warnings drilled into us. I could feel the tension building between us, a silent acknowledgement that Rule 2 was not just a precaution. It was a tether holding sanity together against the suffocating, patient pressure of the trench. As we navigated around a massive rock spire jutting from the abyssal floor, I noticed strange forms gliding in the darkness, barely perceptible, yet undeniably real. The water seemed alive with movement that was almost intelligent, twisting and flowing in response to our lights. I remembered every warning, every anecdote the senior divers had told us about submersibles going silent and disappearing. "They vanish if the lights go out," the captain had said gravely, and I now understood. Even the faintest lapse, even for curiosity, risked erasing all orientation, leaving us as prey in a world built for those who could withstand infinite pressure and observe with eyes we could not see. The diver beside me whispered again, a mix of awe and terror, "Do you think they can see us?" I swallowed hard, keeping my hand steady on the console. "They already do," I replied, forcing a calm I didn't feel. The currents outside pressed against the hull in deliberate patterns, almost like breathing, responding to our movements, our lights, our very existence. Each time I glanced at the glowing ceiling above, I felt the weight of choice, how easy it would be to shut the lights off and let the dark swallow us completely. And yet, the rule existed for a reason. It was our only defense against disorientation, against becoming lost in an abyss designed to consume. Minutes stretched on, each second magnified by the claustrophobic pressure of water and the hypnotic pulse of the glow above. I noticed subtle changes in the sonar, echoes returning from points where nothing should be. I couldn't tell if it was reflection, creature, or something else entirely, but I knew that turning off the lights, even briefly, would erase any chance of orientation. The youngest diver fidgeted again, glancing at the switch, and I had to lay a firm hand on his arm, whispering, "Trust the lights, trust the rule." Rule 2 wasn't just a guideline, it was survival, sanity, and perhaps the only way to avoid drawing attention from whatever watched us, patiently, endlessly, from the dark. As the trench narrowed, funneling our submersible through a tight canyon, the lights cast jagged shadows along the rock walls, revealing strange textures, almost like scales or patterns that didn't belong to any known creature. The currents twisted unpredictably, as if the water itself had learned to anticipate every move we made. I could feel my pulse echo in rhythm with the faint glow, and every flicker above threatened to pull my attention away from our course. The diver beside me kept muttering about curiosity, about how nothing could exist down here, until the pressure shifted unexpectedly, and we all understood, silently, why Rule 2 existed. The abyss demanded obedience, and even the smallest lapse could have consequences we were not yet ready to face. The corridor ahead opened into a wider cavern, revealing vast shadows and flashes of light that made the walls seem to breathe. I leaned forward, gripping the console, forcing my eyes to stay on the instruments, forcing my mind to stay anchored in the reality dictated by the submersible's lights. One glance away could have been our undoing, and yet I felt the magnetic pull of the glow above, of the depths beyond our reach. My hand hovered near the emergency switch, trembling, but I forced it down. Rule 2 had proven itself already, as every time a shadow flickered, every time the water shifted oddly, I knew it was the lights that kept us oriented, that kept us alive, and that kept the abyss from claiming us entirely. We moved deeper, into a labyrinth of jagged walls and sheer drops that seemed to vanish into darkness, the sonar revealing strange echoes from impossible angles. Every pulse of the glow above reminded me that our orientation was fragile, a thread stretched across an infinite void. I whispered to myself again, reinforcing what I already knew. Rule 2 wasn't about light, it was about survival, about control, about not letting curiosity or fear guide our fate. The pressure of the water pressed against the hull like a living thing, and I realized that one wrong flick of the switch could lead to being swallowed completely, lost to the patient, intelligent darkness that observed us. And as the submersible rounded another ledge, I felt the first true tremor of fear, the knowledge that obedience was no longer optional. As the submersible hovered near a glowing cluster of jellyfish-like forms, their faint light casting eerie shadows along the trench walls, I reminded myself, under my breath, of Rule 3. Never attempt to touch any bioluminescent creature, no matter how harmless it appears, or you risk provoking something beyond understanding. My hand itched to reach out, just to feel the delicate pulse of light, but I forced myself back, heart hammering. The creatures moved with a hypnotic rhythm, undulating through the water as if dancing to a tune only they could hear, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking every motion we made. Curiosity and terror collided, making it nearly impossible to focus solely on the submersible's instruments. The diver beside me whispered, "Odd. They look so fragile. Maybe we could." I cut him off sharply, shaking my head, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Any breach of the rule could be catastrophic, and I had already seen how subtle missteps drew attention from forces beyond our comprehension. The lights above flickered slightly, and I felt the water pulse with an almost sentient awareness. Even the smallest touch could provoke a response from the deep. And the thought of what might emerge from the shadows was enough to keep my hands clamped firmly on the controls, my mind racing with every possibility that obeying this rule meant life, and breaking it could mean something far worse. We drifted closer to the ledge where a single enormous bioluminescent creature hung suspended in the water, its translucent body rippling softly in the currents. It was mesmerizing, hypnotic, and the urge to reach out and make contact gnawed at me. The younger diver beside me gasped softly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes locked on the glowing entity, and I could feel his fascination teetering on the edge of disobedience. "Don't even think about it," I hissed, the words vibrating in the cramped cabin. "Remember what it can do if we provoke it." Even as I spoke, my own curiosity burned, and I had to fight the instinct to glance too long, knowing the rule was there to protect not just us, but anyone foolish enough to let the temptation win. The submersible shifted as the water currents pushed it gently against the cavern walls, and I noticed subtle patterns in the glow that suggested intelligence, awareness, and perhaps intent. The creatures seemed to react to our presence, small ripples flowing through the water toward us, though nothing ever touched the hull. I forced myself to log depth and pressure readings, to write everything down with trembling hands, anchoring my mind in procedure instead of obsession. Even with Rule 3 firmly in my thoughts, the environment felt alive, pressing against my senses. whispering that any interaction would have consequences we could never anticipate, and that disobedience could lure something out of hiding. The diver beside me whispered again, softer this time, almost entranced, "It's beautiful. I've never seen anything like this." I swallowed hard, aware of the growing tension, the subtle movement of water that hinted at something watching, something learning from our reactions. I reminded myself that every inch we moved, every second we lingered, brought us closer to testing the limits of the rule. The bioluminescent forms pulsed in patterns that almost felt like communication, and I could sense the presence beyond them, hidden in the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness. I gripped the console tightly, telling myself repeatedly that compliance was safety, curiosity was danger, and the line between the two was razor thin. Minutes passed like hours, each pulse of light accentuating the claustrophobic terror pressing against the hull. I could feel a low vibration beneath my feet, almost like the trench itself was alive, observing and responding. Shadows darted in and out of view, and every flicker above tempted my gaze. I could hear the diver beside me breathing unevenly, and I knew he was fighting the same urge to break the rule, to see, to touch. The sense of intelligence behind the glow was undeniable, and the weight of obeying Rule 3 became a tangible thing, pressing down on my chest, as if to remind me that failure here would not just be a mistake, it could be a sentence. The further we drifted, the more intricate the patterns became, the pulsing rhythm seeming to mirror the quickening beat of my own heart. I tried to remain professional, focusing on reading instruments, noting the faint echoes bouncing off the cavern walls, yet every glance at the bioluminescent creatures was a test of willpower. The water felt thicker here, heavier, as if the abyss itself were aware of our hesitation, measuring our reactions, and learning. I whispered again, barely audible, "Don't reach. Don't even think about it." Obedience to the rule wasn't just instruction. It was the thin barrier keeping us tethered to reality against the infinite patience and intelligence of the deep. A sudden current shifted the submersible slightly, bringing one of the glowing creatures closer than before, its translucent tendrils brushing the water near the hull. I froze, every muscle rigid, heart hammering, aware that a single wrong movement could provoke a response beyond comprehension. The younger diver beside me swallowed hard, whispering, It's so close." I turned to him, eyes wide, voice tight with fear. "Don't even think about touching it. This is why the rule exists." And even as I said it, I felt the pressure of awareness pressing down from the shadows, confirming that Rule 3 was far more than precaution. It was survival, and we were teetering on the edge of a world that did not forgive transgression. The moment a narrow, dark passage opened off the main trench route, I felt the pull of curiosity, a dangerous urge to explore it alone. But I reminded myself firmly of Rule 4. Never separate from the crew, no matter how tempting a passage or tunnel appears, or you risk disappearing without a trace. The shadows within that tunnel seemed almost alive, twisting and beckoning with every pulse of the submersible lights. My hand tightened around the control lever, fighting the instinct to drift closer, to investigate the unknown. The water around us shifted subtly, currents brushing past the hull in ways that hinted at intelligence lurking just beyond the visible glow. I forced my eyes back to the crew, silently promising I wouldn't give in. The younger diver beside me whispered, almost reverently, "It looks like it goes down forever. Maybe there's something incredible there." I shook my head, voice low and urgent, "Don't even think about it. We stick together." His hesitation was palpable, the line between wonder and danger razor thin. I could feel the pressure of the water increasing in that tunnel, dense and suffocating, as though the trench itself were aware of our gaze. Every instinct screamed at me to obey the rule. The moment we separated, we would no longer be anchors to each other, and the abyss could easily claim one of us without anyone noticing until it was too late. As we inched past the edge of the passage, the walls of the trench constricted jagged rock formations, pressing close on either side of the submersible. I felt a tug in my chest, a primal warning that isolation here was more than physical, it was existential. The crew remained clustered near me, shadows and silhouettes blending into the faint luminescence above, and I could feel the weight of Rule 4 pressing down, a tangible force in the cold, dark water. The trench currents twisted in strange, deliberate patterns, almost as if guiding us toward or away from something. I refused to take my eyes off the instruments and the crew, knowing that even a second of hesitation or wandering could result in permanent disappearance. The diver beside me kept glancing toward the passage, his fascination bordering on recklessness. I wonder what's in there," he murmured, voice trembling. I turned sharply, gripping his shoulder. "Wondering will get you killed. Rule 4 exists for a reason." My words felt hollow against the enormity of the abyss surrounding us, but the warning was real. A subtle movement in the shadows beyond the passage made my skin crawl, the water seeming to ripple in acknowledgement of our restraint. Every inch we kept together felt like a small victory against the patience of whatever watched us from the darkness. As we continued along the main route, I noticed fleeting shadows darting in the peripheral glow, shapes that didn't belong to the trench walls or the bioluminescent life forms. My heart raced as I realized the corridor we were in wasn't empty, that unseen presences were assessing us, tracking every hesitation, every glance toward the tempting tunnel. The submersible shifted slightly with the currents, and I held my position, making sure no one drifted even a fraction ahead. Rule 4 wasn't just a guideline, it was a lifeline, a tether to reality and to each other, and the consequences of breaking it were evident in every subtle ripple and shadow that seemed to move with deliberate intelligence. The diver beside me whispered again, nervous and awed, "Do you think anything ever comes out of that passage?" I forced a laugh that sounded hollow, trying to mask my own fear. "If it did, we'd never see it," I said, gripping the console tightly, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing in. The water currents shifted strangely, almost like an exhale from the trench itself, and I understood that the first 3 rules had been preparing us for moments like this. Obedience was more than survival. It was the only shield we had against what existed in the shadows, beyond our comprehension, waiting for even the smallest breach of protocol. Minutes dragged on, the glow from the distant lights above refracting in dizzying patterns across the trench walls. Each time the submersible rocked with the currents, my mind played tricks, creating phantom shapes that seemed to move toward us, toward the passage. I felt my pulse quicken, my focus sharpening, reminding myself that staying with the crew wasn't a choice. It was the difference between being noticed and disappearing. Even the faintest desire to slip away into the darkness was a lure the abyss used to claim victims, and I clenched my jaw, holding tightly to both the controls and the presence of those around me. A low vibration ran through the hull as we moved further along, a subtle but unmistakable pressure in the water that made my chest tighten. The passage ahead remained tempting, flickering in the peripheral light, as though calling to us, daring us to break Rule 4. I caught the younger diver inching forward, curiosity overpowering reason, and I hissed, "Step back, now." He froze instantly, eyes wide, and I could sense his relief mixed with fear. Rule 4 wasn't abstract anymore. It was a living, breathing law of survival, enforced not by humans but by the patient, intelligent darkness surrounding us, waiting for the moment someone strayed alone. The trench widened again, the glow of bioluminescent life forming shifting patterns along the walls and floor. I forced my gaze back to the instruments and the crew, holding my position, every instinct screaming to resist the pull of that tunnel. The shadows seemed to press closer with every hesitation, as if assessing our compliance. I whispered to myself, stay together," feeling the weight of Rule 4 settle into my consciousness like a stone. One lapse, 1 second of temptation, could be the difference between survival and vanishing into the depths. And as the submersible drifted past the dark opening, I felt the patient attention of the trench follow us, reminding me that obedience was the only thing keeping us whole. As I reached toward a nearby console to double-check the pressure readings, I caught myself hesitating, the temptation to touch another diver's instruments creeping into my mind, and I reminded myself firmly of Rule 5. Never interact with any equipment that isn't yours, or you risk triggering catastrophic malfunctions that the abyss will exploit. The warning felt immediate and alive. Every flicker of the submersible lights highlighted the dangers that surrounded us. A subtle vibration ran along the hull, a quiet reminder that the trench was aware of every movement we made. Even the smallest misstep could invite disaster from both the environment and the unseen observers lurking in the darkness. And I forced my hands back to my own controls, heart hammering. The diver beside me, more curious than cautious, reached impulsively for a secondary control panel, and I grabbed his arm sharply. "Stop," I hissed, my pulse spiking. "Rule 5 exists for a reason." He froze, eyes wide, and I could sense his fear mixing with frustration at being restrained. The instruments flickered slightly, responding to the subtle pressure changes outside the hull, as if the abyss itself reacted to our intentions. I realized that every piece of equipment was a tether between us and survival, and tampering with anything not assigned to you could create a domino effect that no human could predict. Obedience was not just caution, it was a lifeline. The water currents around us intensified, swirling with a force that made the submersible rock gently from side to side. Shadows of strange, unseen forms flickered past the portholes, moving with an intelligence that felt predatory and deliberate. I kept my focus on my instruments, noting the readings with trembling fingers, all while resisting the urge to reach for the untouched equipment that might make life easier or more interesting. The slightest interaction could compromise our systems, and the trench seemed to whisper in currents and reflections, warning that consequences would be swift. The rule was simple, yet it carried a weight that became heavier with every second we drifted deeper. Minutes stretched into tense hours as the submersible navigated a winding canyon of jagged rock, the bioluminescent glow above creating illusions of movement that weren't always real. The diver beside me glanced again at the unassigned equipment, and I laid a firm hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Do not touch that." He nodded reluctantly, swallowing hard, aware that compliance was our only defense against the unpredictable abyss. I focused on my own controls, each flick of a switch and push of a button, a reminder that Rule 5 was not merely instruction. It was the difference between life and disaster in a place where even small mistakes could be fatal. The submersible shuddered slightly as a minor current pressed against the hull, causing one of the screens to flicker. I held my breath, watching the light stabilize, heart racing. A shadow moved just beyond the edge of the glow, its form too fluid, too deliberate to be natural. I could feel the unseen presence of the trench evaluating every decision, every touch, and I realized that Rule 5 was about more than equipment. It was about respecting boundaries that kept us tethered to survival. One wrong move could disrupt the delicate balance, and the abyss would seize the opportunity without hesitation. I glanced at the younger diver, whose curiosity was barely contained, eyes flicking toward untouched instruments again. "Trust the rules," I muttered under my breath, almost to myself. The water around us shifted in strange, precise patterns, like currents had a mind of their own, responding to the submersible's every movement. I forced my gaze back to the monitors, recording depth, pressure, and the faint ripples of shadow outside. Every instinct screamed that interacting with anything that wasn't mine would be catastrophic, and yet the temptation was persistent, whispering promises of discovery, of control, but the abyss would not allow it. The diver beside me finally whispered, voice barely audible, "Do you think it notices when we even think about touching things?" I swallowed hard, keeping my focus on my own panel. "It does," I replied, voice tense. The currents shifted, the hull vibrating faintly, and I realized that the trench, alive in its own way, could sense hesitation, curiosity, and defiance. Rule 5 was more than instruction. It was the thin barrier between order and chaos, between safety and something intelligent lurking just beyond our lights. The consequences of crossing it could be immediate or subtle, but always fatal in ways we couldn't predict. As we maneuvered past a jagged ridge, I felt the full weight of the rule pressing on my shoulders. Every inch of space seemed alive, responsive, and ready to exploit mistakes. I watched the instruments carefully, double-checking my work while ensuring that none of the unassigned equipment was touched. The diver beside me shifted nervously, aware of the invisible forces pressing against us, and I whispered once more, "Control only what belongs to you." The tension coiled tighter, the abyss watching silently, patient but alert, and I realized that obedience to Rule 5 was essential, not just for survival, but for maintaining the fragile thread of reality that kept us anchored in this alien world. The submersible entered a wider cavern, and the shadows of the walls stretched long and strange, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. Every pulse of the bioluminescent glow seemed calculated, a reminder that nothing here was random, that the abyss observed and tested us at every turn. I kept my hands firmly on my own controls, recording, monitoring, and resisting temptation. Rule 5 had proven itself again. Interaction with anything unassigned could invite disaster, and the trench was patient, intelligent, and unforgiving. One wrong touch, one lapse in judgment, and we would no longer control our fate. The first time I heard it, a low, rhythmic vibration through the water that wasn't coming from the submersible itself, my heart leapt, and I forced myself to remember Rule 6. Never acknowledge sounds that seem to come from outside the submersible, or you risk drawing attention to yourself. My instincts screamed to respond, to trace the source, to shine the lights in that direction, but I clenched my jaw and focused on the console. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me that recognition alone could provoke the unseen, that the trench had ways of punishing curiosity, and that silence and ignorance were our only shields. The vibrations pulsed again, subtle but insistent, threading through the hull like the faint heartbeat of some colossal creature lurking beyond the lights. The diver beside me tensed, whispering, "Did you feel that too? It's like it's moving along with us." I nodded, forcing a calm I didn't feel, gripping the controls tightly. The presence of the sound was immediate, unnerving, and its source impossible to pinpoint. I had to keep my mind anchored, pretending it didn't exist even as the water itself seemed to thrum in response. Rule 6 was no longer abstract. It was a lifeline, acknowledging even the faintest noise could mark us. And in the Mariana Trench, being marked meant we would never escape the patient gaze of whatever existed in the shadows. Every few seconds, another pulse rattled through the hull, a vibration that seemed deliberate, targeted. I forced myself to stay silent, eyes glued to the monitors, pretending everything was ordinary, even as the diver beside me swallowed audibly, unease evident in every line of his body. The currents outside the submersible shifted in strange, deliberate patterns, almost like communication, and I realized that the abyss could sense hesitation, awareness, and reaction. My mind raced, trying to ignore the sound, to focus on my duties, on keeping the submersible on course, knowing that even a whispered acknowledgement could ripple into disaster. The shadows along the trench walls twisted as the glow above flickered, reflections dancing like warning signals on the hull. The low vibrations pulsed again, closer this time, echoing faintly, as if testing the hull's boundaries. I could feel the diver beside me fighting the urge to investigate, and I muttered sharply, "Ignore it. Pretend it isn't there." He nodded, wide-eyed, clearly struggling against instinct. Rule 6 had become a test of willpower, and the abyss, patient and intelligent, seemed to measure our resolve, counting our failures silently. Even a glance toward the source of the vibration could have been enough to invite attention, and I felt the weight of that knowledge pressing down like the water outside. Minutes dragged on, stretching into an eternity, as the submersible drifted further into the trench. Every pulse, every subtle vibration through the hull, kept my senses taut and my thoughts frantic. Shadows darted just beyond the range of our lights, and I forced my eyes back to the instruments, reminding myself that recognition was danger, and ignorance was survival. The diver beside me whispered again, nervously, "It's so hard to ignore, I can feel it following us." I took a deep breath, gripping the console tightly, whispering under my breath to myself, Ignore it, ignore it. Rule 6 wasn't just precaution, it was a fragile shield, keeping the abyss from noticing our awareness, from singling us out, and keeping the balance between life and being consumed intact. The trench narrowed, the walls pressing in, shadows coiling in ways that seemed impossible. Each pulse of vibration from outside synchronized disturbingly with the faint flickers of bioluminescent light, as though the creatures above were aware of us noticing, or pretending not to notice. I could feel the presence of something intelligent, patient, and hungry, assessing our restraint, and I reminded myself of the weight of Rule 6. Any acknowledgement could ripple outward, drawing attention that would never release us. I focused entirely on my controls, my hands locked in place, heart hammering, as the abyss seemed to breathe around us, testing our silence, testing our obedience. The diver beside me finally swallowed and muttered, almost inaudibly, "Do you think it's just the current?" I shook my head, forcing a laugh that felt hollow. "No," I said softly, voice taut. "It's more. That's why the rule exists." The vibrations pulsed again, closer than before, and I could feel my pulse aligning with them, a terrifying synchronicity. Rule 6 had never felt so crucial. It wasn't just about ignoring sound. It was about convincing the abyss we didn't notice, that we were nothing, insignificant, obedient, so that whatever lurked in the darkness would leave us unmarked. And as the submersible moved past a jagged ridge, the vibration shifted subtly, almost like a warning, and I knew the trench was watching, waiting for the moment someone faltered. As we navigated a narrow channel between towering rock formations, I felt the hull groan slightly under the immense weight of water above, and I reminded myself, with a tense exhale, of Rule 7. Never underestimate the pressure of the trench, or you risk being crushed or trapped by sudden shifts in the environment. Every inch deeper reminded me that the abyss was not just dark, it was an active force, pressing, shifting, testing our fragile vessel and our nerves alike. The walls around us were jagged, and even the faintest movement of water sent small vibrations through the hull, a constant reminder that any lapse in attention could be catastrophic. The diver beside me glanced nervously at the readings, and I knew we were skating on the knife edge of survival. The submersible drifted closer to an overhang, where the rock above seemed precariously suspended, and a subtle tremor rippled along the hull. "Do you think it can hold?" the younger diver whispered, eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, trying to steady my own panic. One wrong move, and we could be trapped or crushed. "That's why Rule 7 exists," I replied, voice low, almost a mantra against the pressure. Every pulse of water seemed deliberate, as though the trench itself were a living entity, aware of our presence, patient yet immensely powerful. The faint glow of bioluminescence above reflected off jagged surfaces, creating shadows that danced like ominous warnings. As we navigated the tight passage, the submersible creaked and shuddered under the immense pressure, each groan reverberating through my chest. I could feel the diver beside me gripping the console tightly, jaw set, eyes darting nervously between the instruments and the looming walls. A sudden surge of water from a shifting current pressed the hull toward the rock wall, forcing me to correct our position quickly. My pulse raced as I realized just how fragile our sanctuary was, and the lesson of Rule 7 pressed itself on me like the very water surrounding us. Any underestimation could result in instant catastrophe, a cruel end beneath crushing pressure, and we had to remain vigilant. The corridor ahead narrowed further, twisting in ways that made our instruments occasionally flicker with false readings. Shadows warped and elongated in the diffused glow, creating illusions of space that didn't exist. I forced myself to stay calm, monitoring depth, pressure, and orientation as if my life depended on it, which it did. The diver beside me whispered again, voice quivering, "I can feel it, like the trench is alive." I swallowed hard, nodding in agreement silently. The pressure wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a constant reminder that this environment punished overconfidence or distraction. Rule 7 was not an exaggeration, it was an unyielding law of survival. Minutes dragged as we moved cautiously, the submersible responding slowly to our careful maneuvers. Each shift of water, each micro tremor in the walls made my chest tighten. I could feel my own heartbeat in sync with the subtle pulse of the trench around us. The lights above flickered, reflecting off distant formations in the distance, and I forced myself to ignore the mesmerizing patterns. Even one glance or distraction could lead to a mistake that might allow the immense pressure to exploit a misjudgment. Rule 7 was not theoretical, it was tangible, an invisible hand pressing against every decision we made. A low vibration surged through the hull, a subtle reminder that the trench itself was aware, assessing, testing our control. I gritted my teeth, adjusting controls minutely, keeping the submersible steady and noting every anomaly. The diver beside me muttered, almost inaudibly, "Do you think the walls could collapse?" I shook my head, swallowing hard. If we underestimate it for even a second, we'd be trapped, crushed. "That's what Rule 7 is about," I said, voice strained. I felt a shiver run through me, knowing that obedience wasn't just caution, it was survival against an environment that had existed far longer than any human and would not hesitate to destroy what it could. As we moved past a jagged ridge, the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, as if responding to our presence. The pressure fluctuated slightly, subtle but noticeable, enough to make me grip the console tighter. The faint glow above cast strange reflections on the trench walls, elongating the shadows of our submersible in ways that made the space feel alive and hostile. I reminded myself repeatedly to respect every subtle change, every shift of weight, because the trench was patient, intelligent, and merciless. Rule 7 had already proven its importance, and I knew that any lapse could be fatal, leaving us crushed or trapped, swallowed by forces far beyond human comprehension. The diver beside me finally muttered, almost a whisper, "It feels like it's trying to squeeze us." I swallowed hard, my hands locked firmly on the controls. "It is," I said, voice low. "We follow the rule, we survive. One mistake, one underestimation, and it will claim us." The submersible rocked gently as a current twisted past, and I felt the weight of the trench around us, not just as water, but as an intelligent, patient force that could punish hesitation or arrogance. Rule 7 wasn't just a guideline, it was a boundary between life and being swallowed whole, a lesson written into the very fabric of this abyss. And as the corridor ahead twisted into darkness, I knew we were only just beginning to feel the true weight of the depths. As the submersible drifted deeper, I noticed a faint chill creeping along my skin, subtle but insistent, and I reminded myself of Rule 8. Never ignore changes in water temperature, no matter how subtle, or you risk encountering lethal currents or unseen predators. The temperature gauge flickered slightly, and I could feel the shift in the water pressing against the hull differently. The diver beside me shivered, eyes wide, glancing nervously at the surrounding darkness. Even the bioluminescent glow above seemed to pulse irregularly, like a warning we were crossing an invisible threshold, and I forced myself to tighten my grip on the controls, anchoring my senses to the instruments instead of imagination. A subtle current shifted the submersible, brushing us sideways against the trench wall. "Did you feel that?" the younger diver whispered, voice quivering. I nodded, heart racing. "Yes, the temperature change is altering the currents. That's why Rule 8 exists." Every instinct screamed that these shifts were more than natural. They were deliberate, almost intelligent, like the trench itself manipulated the water to test or trap us. Shadows flickered unnaturally along jagged rocks outside, and I felt the cold fingers of fear crawl down my spine, reminding me that ignoring even the faintest variation could be fatal. The deeper we went, the colder the water became, the temperature dropping in subtle increments that seemed to affect everything, our instruments, the hull, and even our perception. I noticed the diver glancing toward a flicker of movement outside, a shape barely discernible in the pale glow. "Do you think it's just the current?" he asked nervously. I shook my head, knowing better. Rule 8 wasn't about imagination. It was about survival. Lethal currents could twist the submersible into hazards, and predators lurking in the darkness could detect even the slightest lapse, drawn by the vibrations of fear or error. A sudden rush of cold water pressed against the hull, and I felt the submersible rock violently. The diver beside me gripped his seat tightly, eyes wide with terror, and I muttered, "Stay calm, don't react hastily." Rule 8 exists for a reason. The chill wasn't just temperature, it carried the presence of the abyss, subtle and intelligent, probing for weakness. Every pulse of bioluminescent light seemed to reveal shapes that weren't entirely natural, shadows bending and twisting, as if testing our awareness. I fought the urge to peer too closely, knowing that any distraction could provoke the currents or draw attention from what lurked unseen. Minutes passed, the water alternating between stillness and sudden, almost imperceptible shifts. I monitored the gauges obsessively, noting temperature variations and subtle pressure changes. The diver beside me swallowed nervously, whispering, "It feels alive." I nodded, voice taut with tension. That's the point. Never ignore it. That's what Rule 8 is about. Every movement of the submersible became a delicate negotiation with forces far beyond human control. Ignoring the subtle variations could mean being swept into a crushing current or drawing the attention of predators too massive, too intelligent, to be visible in our lights. The trench twisted ahead, forming a narrow chasm that funneled the currents like a funnel. I could feel the pressure of the colder water against the hull, uneven and unpredictable. Shadows moved unnaturally in the glow, like living entities waiting for a mistake. The diver beside me whispered, "Do you think there's something hunting us?" I exhaled slowly, keeping my focus on the gauges. It wouldn't need to. The water itself is hunting. That's why Rule 8 exists. Each subtle temperature change was a signal, a test, a hidden warning from the abyss, and I realized that vigilance wasn't optional. One lapse, one glance away, and we could be swept into darkness or drawn to unseen jaws. As the submersible edged further along the chasm, the temperature gauge flickered again, barely noticeable, but enough to make my pulse quicken. Currents swirled in strange, precise ways, as if guiding us towards something or away from it. The diver beside me held his breath, glancing nervously at the shadows. "It's colder here," he murmured. I nodded grimly, eyes fixed on the instruments. The abyss was patient, observing, testing, and ready to exploit any lapse. Rule 8 wasn't just a precaution, it was a tether to survival, and every shift in water temperature could be a predator's signal or a trap, waiting for the slightest misstep. The glow above flickered again, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living shapes. I could feel the currents pressing differently, subtle waves brushing the hull, testing our response. Every vibration, every chill, reminded me that ignoring Rule 8 wasn't an option. I whispered under my breath, "Stay alert. Every change matters." The diver beside me nodded, swallowing hard. The abyss seemed to shift with us, an unseen force learning, adjusting, and waiting for even the faintest acknowledgement of its presence. And as we drifted forward, deeper into the icy water, I knew the slightest lapse in vigilance could be the difference between life and being swallowed completely. As the submersible descended closer to the trench floor, a strange unease settled over me, and I reminded myself of Rule 9. Never linger near the trench floor for too long, or you risk awakening things that should remain undisturbed. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the abyssal plains, faint shapes flickering in the dim bioluminescent light. The sediment below seemed to shift slightly, as if stirred by something alive and massive. My fingers clenched the console tightly, resisting the urge to hover closer to the floor, knowing that even a few extra moments could summon dangers beyond imagination. Every second we lingered felt like a gamble, a test of patience against the unknown. The diver beside me whispered nervously, "It's so quiet down there." "Too quiet." I nodded, keeping my focus on the instruments, while my mind raced with possibilities. Rule 9 wasn't simply a precaution, it was an unspoken agreement with the abyss. Every lingering second allowed the trench to observe, assess, and if necessary, act. The faint glow of bioluminescent creatures reflected off jagged formations on the floor, shadows bending as if to suggest hidden movement. Even the subtle vibration of water against the hull felt charged, tense, almost like a warning not to linger. My heart pounded with each passing moment, aware that the abyss was patient, but deadly when disrespected. Minutes stretched painfully as we drifted slowly above the dark sediment, the diver beside me shifting uneasily. "Should we move higher?" he murmured, voice tight with unease. I swallowed, nodding, and muttered, "We have to." Rule 9 exists for a reason. The faint shapes on the trench floor appeared to respond to our presence, subtle movements that suggested eyes or appendages we couldn't see fully. My mind raced with the knowledge that even hesitation could provoke a predator, or an intelligence that had evolved in absolute darkness. Remaining too long meant becoming a part of the abyss, marked and observed. I forced myself to focus on our ascent, every meter a small victory over instinctual curiosity. The submersible tilted slightly as currents from the floor pushed against us, swirling fine sediment into the glowing light above. I could see fleeting shapes, perhaps animals, perhaps shadows, moving beneath the haze. "Did you see that?" the diver whispered, panic threading his voice. I shook my head, forcing calm over the fear creeping into my chest. "Don't react, just move. That's why Rule 9 exists." Obedience wasn't just precaution, it was survival, the thin line keeping us from awakening forces that had no reason to show mercy. The trench seemed to thrum, the pressure of unseen presence pressing against the hull like fingers testing our resolve. As we edged further along, the submersible's lights reflected off an enormous ridge, partially buried in sediment, casting twisting shadows across the floor. I felt an instinctual shiver crawl down my spine, the sensation that something massive lurked just out of sight. "I don't like this," the diver whispered, swallowing hard. I clenched my jaw, reminding myself that lingering any longer could be fatal. Rule 9 had proven itself in countless moments, a warning against curiosity and overconfidence. The trench was patient but aware. Remaining too long near its floor would not go unnoticed, and I could feel the weight of that invisible gaze pressing down on every inch of our submersible. The current shifted again, brushing against the hull in subtle but deliberate patterns. The diver beside me gripped the console tightly, breathing unevenly, eyes darting toward the floor. "It feels alive down there," he whispered. I nodded grimly, my hands steadying the controls. Rule 9 wasn't about fear, it was about survival, a boundary that kept us alive while the abyss remained indifferent to human presence. The sediment below stirred faintly, suggesting movement, intelligence, and perhaps hunger. Every second spent too close to the floor increased the risk, and I reminded myself to maintain distance, to respect the warning embedded deep within the rule. As the submersible rose slightly, the floor receded into darkness, and the shadows seemed to settle back into the sediment. I exhaled shakily, tension coiling in my chest. The diver beside me relaxed marginally, but the fear in his eyes remained palpable. I reminded myself silently that Rule 9 was not negotiable. The trench had patience measured in hours and days, but it also had power beyond comprehension, and lingering too long could awaken forces that would not forgive curiosity. Even as we drifted higher, I could feel a presence lingering just beyond the glow, watching, waiting, and assessing, ready to punish any lapse in judgment. The abyss was alive in its own way, and respect was the only thing keeping us whole. The moment we drifted near a faint, eerie glow emanating from a fissure in the trench wall, a chill ran through me, and I forced my mind to recall Rule 10. Never stare directly into any uncharted light source, or you risk drawing something's attention that should remain hidden. The light pulsed softly, almost rhythmically, and I felt its pull like a magnet against my instincts. My eyes itched to focus, to see what could be producing such unnatural brilliance. But I clenched my jaw and looked away. Every fiber of the trench seemed aware of the light and our attention, and I knew that breaking this rule would invite consequences beyond imagination. The diver beside me whispered, voice tight with curiosity, "It's glowing. Should we check it out?" I shook my head sharply, voice low and tense. "No, don't even think about it. Rule 10 exists for a reason." The submersible's hull shivered slightly as the glow pulsed again, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. Even from the corner of my eye, I could feel the presence of intelligence beyond comprehension, lurking behind the uncharted illumination. The trench itself felt alive in those moments, patient and calculating, aware of every glance and hesitation, measuring our compliance with rules designed to protect life in a place where curiosity could be fatal. As we inched past the fissure, the light flickered and shifted, teasing shapes in the water that weren't entirely natural. I forced my gaze on the instruments, tracking our depth, orientation, and currents obsessively, every pulse of the glow sending shivers through my spine. The diver beside me swallowed audibly, glancing nervously toward the light, and I hissed, "Don't even look directly at it." Obedience to Rule 10 was no longer optional. The abyss had eyes everywhere, and acknowledging this unnatural glow could draw the attention of something massive, intelligent, and patient. The water itself seemed to pulse in response to our restraint, testing how long we could maintain composure. A subtle current pressed against the hull, pushing us ever so slightly toward the fissure. Shadows from the glowing light warped across the trench walls, creating illusions of movement that made my stomach knot. I could feel the diver beside me struggling with curiosity, his eyes flicking toward the light despite my warnings. "It's mesmerizing," he whispered. I swallowed hard, gripping the console tightly. "Exactly, that's why we don't look directly. Rule 10 keeps us unseen." Even from a distance, the light had a presence, a subtle intelligence that reacted to our recognition, and I forced myself to record every reading, every shadow, obsessively anchoring myself in procedure to resist temptation. Minutes dragged as we drifted past the fissure, the glow pulsing softly, almost beckoning. The shadows twisted in ways that seemed deliberate, stretching unnaturally along the trench walls, hinting at shapes we couldn't fully comprehend. I could feel the submersible rocking slightly in response to unseen currents, each vibration a reminder of the abyss's patience. The diver beside me whispered again, almost inaudibly, "I can feel it watching." I nodded grimly, voice tight. Exactly why we follow Rule 10. Recognition is danger. Ignorance is protection. Every pulse of that light was a test, a subtle measurement of our restraint, and I understood that even a fleeting glance could invite attention from something far beyond human understanding. The trench narrowed ahead, currents swirling unpredictably, the faint glow still visible in the distance. I forced my focus entirely on the instruments, monitoring depth, pressure, and velocity, ignoring the urge to glance toward the fissure again. Shadows danced in the periphery, a subtle reminder that even our peripheral awareness was noted. The diver beside me swallowed hard, muttering, "It feels alive, like it knows we're here." I exhaled slowly, gripping the controls, whispering, "That's why we never stare. That's why Rule 10 exists." Compliance wasn't just precaution. It was a shield against drawing attention to ourselves from whatever lurked in the darkness beyond comprehension. As we drifted further along, the glow faded behind us, but its effect lingered. I could feel the tension in the submersible, the subtle awareness of the trench pressing on us as if evaluating every decision. Even as our eyes avoided the light, the knowledge that it was there, observing us, remained. Rule 10 had proven itself again. Staring could provoke, could mark, could summon attention from unseen forces. And as the submersible continued deeper into darkness, I realized that disobedience here would not just be a mistake. It could be the last act of anyone foolish enough to give in to curiosity. By the time we reached the narrowest section of the trench, I felt the weight of exhaustion pressing against every nerve, and I reminded myself with trembling focus of Rule 11. Never break the last rule, for it is the one that nobody survives if ignored. The lights flickered along the submersible walls, shadows contorting into impossible shapes. The crew around me shifted nervously, glancing at me with silent fear, aware that this was the final boundary, the culmination of all prior rules. Every pulse of the water seemed deliberate, pressing, as though the abyss itself waited for anyone to falter. I could almost hear the faint, patient hum of the trench, as if it anticipated the inevitability of disobedience and death. The diver beside me swallowed hard, whispering, I feel like we're not supposed to be here anymore." I shook my head, voice low and tense. "We can't break it now. Rule 11 is the ultimate boundary. One misstep, one ignored caution, and nothing would save us." The submersible rocked slightly with a subtle current, shadows stretching along the trench walls like long spectral fingers. I realized then that Rule 11 wasn't just about survival. It was about respect for the abyss, acknowledgement of forces beyond human comprehension, and the recognition that some boundaries exist because life itself depends on them. Every second of hesitation, every fleeting glance toward forbidden spaces, seemed measured, observed, tested. A faint glow pulsed far below, smaller than anything we'd seen, but unnaturally bright against the inky darkness of the trench floor. My pulse spiked as I resisted the urge to investigate, reminding myself silently that curiosity was a trap. The diver beside me whispered, "It's calling us." I swallowed hard, gripping the console. "No, Rule 11, I said firmly. "We obey." The currents shifted subtly, almost playful, as if the abyss itself mocked restraint. Every rule we had followed brought us here, to the final test, and I understood that ignoring this last boundary would erase us entirely, leaving only echoes in the cold, crushing dark. The submersible shuddered under unseen pressure, subtle but insistent, reminding me that the trench had ways of punishing those who faltered. Shadows moved in impossible patterns across the walls, shapes that didn't belong to any creature I'd ever studied. "Do you think it's alive?" the diver whispered nervously, voice quivering. I shook my head, staring at my instruments, and repeating the mantra in my mind, "Obey, Rule 11. The abyss did not act out of malice, it acted out of law, an intelligence older than any human comprehension. Breaking this final rule was not a matter of curiosity. It was an irreversible sentence. Every second felt stretched, the silence around us thick and patient, like the trench itself was waiting for the inevitable mistake. I could feel the pressure of the water, the weight of all 11 rules pressing down, each one guiding us toward this precise moment. The diver beside me glanced toward a shadow just beyond our glow, and I caught his hand, squeezing it firmly. "Do not," I whispered. "We follow Rule 11. The abyss seemed to respond, currents shifting subtly, shadows bending, a reminder that disobedience would not go unnoticed. Every instinct screamed that this was the ultimate test, and we were being measured for even the smallest lapse. A distant flicker appeared in the darkness, something that seemed to pulse with awareness, as though it could sense even the smallest wavering of attention. I forced myself to monitor every gauge, every display, clinging to control, clinging to obedience. The diver beside me whispered once more, almost pleadingly, "What happens if we fail?" I swallowed hard, voice low and strained. "Then nobody survives. That's the point of Rule 11. The water seemed to tighten around us, the currents whispering threats that only we could feel, a patient intelligence testing our restraint. Rule 11 was not a guideline, it was the abyss's last word, and failure was absolute. As we drifted deeper into the narrow trench corridor, every shadow and flicker of light seemed charged with intent. I could feel the weight of centuries of pressure, life and unseen predators pressing in. Every movement, every breath, had to be calculated, every glance had to be controlled. The diver beside me swallowed hard, eyes wide with realization, and I whispered, "We obey, or we vanish. That's all there is." The submersible creaked under the immense weight, and the abyss seemed almost alive, patient, waiting, watching. Rule 11 was complete, in its terror, It was the boundary we could not cross, the law we could not ignore, the invisible sentinel, ensuring that no curiosity, no mistake, would survive here. And as we drifted silently through the oppressive darkness, I realized the truth. The trench watches, it waits, and the last rule, the one everyone whispers about, it never forgets. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.